What's the difference between worldly sorrow and godly sorrow? That's what's coming up in today's Ask the Counselor. When the Apostle Paul had to confront members of the Corinthian church, which he dearly loved, he later rejoiced that they experienced something he called godly sorrow. Why? Here's what he said. Now I rejoice, not that you were made sorry, but that your sorrow led to repentance. For you were made sorry in a godly manner. For godly sorrow produces repentance, leading to salvation, not to be regretted, but the sorrow of the world produces death. Here, Paul contrasts godly sorrow and worldly sorrow. The first kind of sorrow clearly leads to repentance and salvation. The second kind of sorrow leads to death. All sexual addicts experience sorrow. After each fall into sin, they experience regret, remorse, maybe even piercing grief. But many of them, after years of being unable to find true freedom, begin to ask the question, is the kind of sorrow I am experiencing godly sorrow or worldly sorrow? The question is a good one because the stakes are so high. One leads to salvation, the other leads to death. Okay then, since it's only natural for someone to feel sorrow after sinning, and especially due to the consequences that inevitably follow, how can anyone really be sure they are experiencing godly sorrow and not just worldly sorrow? Today, we will tackle this issue by taking a look at some of the basic characteristics of worldly sorrow and contrasting these with the essential characteristics of godly sorrow. Let's begin with worldly sorrow. The main characteristic of worldly sorrow is that it is completely selfish and self-centered. And we will look at 3 ways its self-centeredness manifests itself. Worldly sorrow focuses on how my sin affects me. This type of sorrow is mostly concerned with the effects that sin is having on my life. In other words, it's all about me and any potential negative impact that is due to my sin. It is a grieving over personal loss. For some, this could simply be experiencing sorrow because they have been caught in sin. They have lived a double life of secret sin for so long, and now the truth is out. Many grieve over the potential loss of reputation due to the exposure of their sin. Others may grieve over the disastrous effects to their marriage, the possibility of divorce, the loss of a job due to their sin, legal issues, or even possible jail time. The list is endless, but the focus is the same. It's all about how this sin is affecting me. Because the focus of worldly sorrow is on self, a lot of other self-sins come along with it. A big one here is self-pity or feeling sorry for yourself. The thought behind this may be, I can't believe I would do something like this. What a mess I've made of my life. Another one is self-protection. I can't let anyone find out about this. Or, if your sin has been exposed, this could come in the form of self-justification. What do you expect? I'm only human. No one's perfect. Self-effort is another common sin which can amount at times to nothing more than damage control. I will figure this out, or I can fix this. We could go on and on here, but one final sin I will mention is self-loathing. With this comes thoughts such as, I am such a despicable person. No wonder I keep doing things like this. Left unchecked, this could also lead into self-condemnation. I'm hopeless. What's the use of even trying anymore? Another aspect of worldly sorrow is that it is focused on how people are treating me. This is potentially a huge issue for people that are experiencing worldly sorrow. The way other people treat you is extremely important to you when your primary focus is on yourself, your reputation, your feelings, and your own personal well-being. Let's face it, being in sin will inevitably damage relationships. The person in worldly sorrow will therefore be highly motivated to do whatever it takes to smooth things over and restore the relationships in their lives that have been damaged by their sin. This motivation could be the result of a hurt wife that issues her husband an ultimatum. Either quit your sin or our marriage is over. Or maybe it comes in the form of church discipline. But whatever it looks like, as long as the heat is on, this person will appear willing to do whatever it takes to be free from their sin and get back to life as normal. Often, it is at this point that the person in worldly sorrow will make promises such as, "I promise to do better," or "I'll never do it again." But these tend to be short-lived. Typically, those who are experiencing worldly sorrow will only feel sorry as long as their sin is negatively affecting the way others treat them or relate to them. The problem here is that they have not truly repented. So, once the pressure is off and relationships have been mended, they will often go right back into their sin like a dog returning to its vomit. One last aspect of worldly sorrow is that it is focused on what is happening right now, grieving over temporal and immediate consequences of your sin. How is my life being impacted right now? Typically, the person with worldly sorrow would have no problem continuing their sin, provided there were no negative or immediate consequences in their life. Since worldly sorrow is primarily selfish, its main concern is about what am I experiencing in the moment, as opposed to having an eternal perspective. This sorrow may be extremely powerful in the present, but these feelings will eventually wear off. In the absence of such feelings, any real motivation for change will be gone, along with any desire to stay the course and fight through to victory, especially in the midst of the powerful temptations that will inevitably occur. In contrast to this, the battle to overcome sexual sin will require a commitment over the long haul to do whatever it takes to find freedom. It will take a fighting spirit within to put to death the very lusts thought to bring the most pleasure. Victory will not come easy. So, as you can see, worldly sorrow is real sorrow, but its focus is completely wrong because everything about it is self-centered. On the other hand, godly sorrow has a completely different focus. It is centered on the things that God cares about. The person experiencing godly sorrow has their eyes open and is beginning to see how their sexual sin has torn apart their relationship with God. Their primary concern is now over how their sin has grieved the heart of God. The thought that their sin has pained God can at times be overwhelming and even unbearable. At this point, every other consideration pales by comparison, and the attitude of their heart is like David when he cried out in Psalm 51, "Against you, you only have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment." Gone are the excuses or the justifications for their sin, as they are swallowed up in the grief of having offended a holy God and sinned against His infinite goodness and mercy. This sorrow creates within them a desire above all else to be restored into a right relationship with God and be pleasing in His sight, that their lives would bring Him pleasure rather than grief or pain. Godly sorrow desires not only to be forgiven and restored into a right relationship with God, but at all cost to be cleansed from the very sin that has so hurt and offended God. The cry is for cleansing not only from the guilt, but also from the pollution of sin. David continues, "Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." After dealing with the devastation of how their sin has affected God, the person experiencing godly sorrow begins to realize how their sin has hurt others. not just how their sin has negatively impacted their relationship with others, but rather how their sin has impacted those people personally. Many sexual addicts have been blind to the pain, grief, and devastation that their actions have caused others. In the past, they were oblivious, but they begin to experience the pain of godly sorrow as the reality of their past sin comes into sharp focus. At one time, they may have considered their sexual sin as one small problem. They now see it as enormous, and not only this, but also that their whole selfish way of living has been detrimental to others. Their selfishness, pride, anger, and criticism have hurt others and made life very difficult for them. The godly sorrow generated by this realization should lead them to repentance and the desire for restitution, to make things right with others for their sake and out of love for them. Unlike worldly sorrow, godly sorrow has an eternal perspective and is more concerned about the consequences over the long haul than the immediate effects of sin. It is only those who begin to experience genuine godly sorrow that will have the spiritual strength and vision to look beyond the temporary pleasures of sin to see the consequences. They see sin for the hideous thing that it is, and how their sinful actions will bring pain to God, pain to others, and ultimately to themselves, as it will bring ruin to their lives both now and throughout eternity. In light of what we have looked at concerning this type of sorrow, it is evident that the fruit of godly sorrow is repentance. The sorrowing one begins to hate the sin itself, not just the consequences of sin. Seeing sin in its proper light, the person experiencing godly sorrow considers sin to be their deadly enemy and something to be avoided at all costs. Their sorrow is a godly catalyst causing them to turn from sin and turn to God. Godly sorrow leads to a change of heart and mind about sin and results in an outward change for the better, so that those who experience this type of sorrow will choose to go and sin no more and do what is right in the sight of God. So we see there is a stark contrast between worldly sorrow and godly sorrow. Worldly sorrow is selfish and self-centered. Worldly sorrow is sorrow that you got caught, sorrow that your sin has cost you something, sorrow that you have to pay the consequences. Worldly sorrow, Paul said, leads to death. Godly sorrow, on the other hand, is not selfish at all. It is sorrow that your sin has offended God. It is sorrow that your sin has hurt others. It is a sorrow that causes you to hate the sin itself and to desire with all your heart to turn from it and be cleansed from it. Godly sorrow, Paul said, produces repentance without regret, leading to salvation.